My father stood at the center of my sister's wedding reception, champagne glass in hand, beaming at a room full of 200 people, and announced to every single one of them that he was still covering my college tuition. The laughter was polite. The looks people sent my way were sympathetic. My sister sat at the head table with the satisfied expression of someone watching a plan go exactly the way they drew it up. My mother touched her necklace and smiled the way she only smiled when she thought she'd won something. What none of them understood, not my father at the microphone, not my sister in her dress, not a single person in that country club ballroom, was that I had graduated 8 months earlier, that I had a career, that I was already earning more than my sister's brand new husband. And when my father turned toward me and held out the microphone expecting a grateful thank you speech, he handed me something he didn't mean to. He handed me the room, and I used it. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is for every person who was quietly written off by the people who should have believed in them first, and who eventually got to tell their own story in their own words. Stay with me, because this one ends exactly the way it should. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you can't understand what happened at that reception without understanding the family that produced it. My name is Vivian Cole. I'm 27 years old, and I grew up in a house where the rules were simple, even if nobody ever said them out loud. My sister Amber was the story. I was the footnote. Amber was 2 years older than me, and from the time we were small, she existed at the center of everything. Every holiday, every dinner table conversation, every parental investment of time, money, and attention. When Amber got average grades in middle school, my parents hired tutors to bring them up. When I graduated near the top of my class in high school, they said, "That's great, honey," and moved on to talking about Amber's new boyfriend. When Amber wanted a car at 19, my father made it happen within the month. When I needed money for textbooks, I picked up weekend shifts at a cafe because asking felt pointless. That was just how the math worked in our family. And somewhere around age 15, I stopped being surprised by it and started doing something more useful with my energy. I started building. I chased every scholarship I could find. I applied for internships earlier than most of my classmates thought to. I worked part-time through all 4 years of college, not because I enjoyed it, but because I had figured out very early that if I was going to have the future I wanted, I was going to have to construct it myself without waiting for anyone to hand me the materials. The small amount of tuition support my parents did provide came with what I can only describe as a subscription, a running reminder deployed at family gatherings and phone calls and random Tuesday afternoons of how generously they were contributing to my life. I absorbed it. I said thank you. And I kept building. By the time Amber got engaged, I was 2 semesters from finishing my degree in data analytics and 2 months from accepting an internship that would convert to a full-time offer. Nobody in my family knew any of that because nobody in my family had asked. What they asked constantly in the year leading up to the wedding was whether I was available for venue tours and florist consultations and engagement party planning and rehearsal dinners and every other gravitational event in Amber's expanding orbit. When I couldn't attend something because I had a work deadline or a class, my mother called it an attitude problem. My father called it selfish. Amber stopped texting me directly and started sending messages through my mother, which was somehow worse. Then came the phone call. 3 weeks before the wedding, my father called and got directly to the point, which was more than he usually managed. He said I had been disappointing the family. He said my absence at wedding events was hurting Amber. He said they were all tired of my behavior. And then, with the confidence of a man who believed he was holding the only card that mattered, he said if I couldn't show up and support my sister properly, they would stop paying my tuition. I sat very still on the other end of that call and let him finish. He had no idea that I'd already graduated. He had no idea I'd accepted a full-time position with a tech firm 4 months earlier, a remote role with a base salary that had genuinely surprised me when the offer letter arrived. He had no idea that I had been financially independent for the better part of a year. managing my own rent and insurance and savings contributions without a single dollar from my parents. He didn't know any of it because he'd never asked. Not once in 4 months had my father called to ask how my last semester went, or whether I'd finished my thesis, or what I was doing after graduation. The only topic that had warranted a call from him in nearly a year was Amber's wedding. "Of course," I said when he finished his ultimatum. My voice was completely calm. There was a small pause on his end. He'd been expecting resistance. He'd prepared for pushback. Instead, he got 3 words delivered without a trace of tension. The confidence came back into his voice immediately. He wrapped up the call quickly, satisfied. He thought he'd handled it. I sat there after we hung up and felt something I hadn't felt in years. The specific, clean relief of holding something true that nobody else in the room knows yet. They were pulling a string that wasn't attached to anything anymore. I wasn't afraid of them. I hadn't been for months. I just hadn't told them that. I showed up to everything they asked me to in the 3 weeks before the wedding. Rehearsal dinner, final planning meeting, family breakfast the morning of the ceremony. My parents were visibly relieved. Amber interpreted my cooperation as surrender. I let all of them believe whatever they needed to believe, because the truth was going to arrive on its own schedule and I didn't need to rush it. 2 days before the wedding, I received the reception program in a group text from my mother. I read through it once, then I read it again. There was a section near the back labeled Family Reflections, a series of scheduled speeches from relatives. My name was in it. The slot description next to my name said, "Words of gratitude." I understood exactly what that meant. I was expected to stand up in front of 200 people and thank my parents for their support, in the same room where my father had already been describing that support to anyone who would listen for the past several hours. The wedding itself was held at a country club outside the city, the kind of venue that has a fountain in the driveway and a maitre d' who calls everyone sir and ma'am, regardless of age. Amber moved through it like someone who had been rehearsing this specific day since early childhood, which I suppose she had. My mother trailed behind her, making sure every detail matched the version she'd imagined. My father barely acknowledged me when I arrived. He patted me on the shoulder and said, "Glad you came around." I said nothing. The ceremony was beautiful, genuinely. I'm not a person who diminishes the things that deserve to be recognized, and Amber's vows were real, and her husband Connor looked at her like she was the only thing in the room. Whatever the complications of our family, what happened between the two of them at that altar was sincere. I sat in my row and felt something uncomplicated about it, which surprised me. Then dinner ended and the speeches began. The first few were warm and funny. College friends telling stories, an aunt with a joke that landed better than expected. Then my mother stood up. She started with Amber's achievements, Amber's warmth, Amber's journey to this day, and then gradually she turned the speech towards something else. She talked about sacrifice. She talked about what parents give. She talked about the years of support, the financial investment, the doors opened. She said the word support 4 times in 90 seconds. I watched the room absorb it. Several guests glanced in my direction. My mother sat down looking pleased. My father stood up. He was less subtle. He praised Amber and Connor as examples of what hard work and stability looked like. He talked about the next generation, about family investment, about children who understood the value of what was given to them. Then, without saying my name, he started talking about people who still needed guidance, people who were still finding their footing, people who ought to appreciate what they had. He looked at me briefly when he said it, briefly enough to be deniable, long enough for everyone nearby to follow his eyes. Several guests turned toward me with expressions that ranged from sympathy to mild discomfort. Then my father smiled at the room and mentioned the tuition, his continued generosity, his ongoing support, his investment in all of his children. He turned toward me and extended the microphone. I stood up. The room went quiet with the particular attention people give when they sense something unscripted is about to happen. I walked to the front, accepted the microphone, and took a single breath. "I want to start by congratulating Amber and Connor," I said. "I mean that without any qualification. I hope you build something real and lasting together, and I believe you will." The room relaxed slightly. My parents smiled. "I also want to thank my parents for the support they've provided over the years. I know it came from a genuine place." My father's smile widened. "I do want to gently correct one thing, though," I said, "because I think there's been some confusion about where I am in my life right now." The smile didn't disappear immediately. It took about 2 more seconds, which felt much longer. "I graduated 8 months ago," I said. "Finished my degree in data analytics, actually completed it a semester early. I didn't make a big announcement about it because the timing landed in the middle of wedding planning season and I didn't want to redirect any attention." The room was very still. I accepted a full-time position a few months after that with a technology company, remote work, which has been incredible, and I've been financially independent since the spring. I paused. "So the tuition situation has been resolved for a while now. I should have communicated that more clearly. That's on me." A few guests laughed, surprised. Not at me. At the situation, at the gap between the story they'd been given and the one I was currently telling. I kept my voice even, warm even. I wasn't performing outrage. I was simply telling the truth in a room where a different version had just been presented. "I'm proud of what I've built," I said. "I'm proud of how I built it. And I'm genuinely happy to be here celebrating Amber and Connor tonight." I started to hand back the microphone, and then a woman near the third table raised her hand slightly, the way people do when they're not sure they're allowed to ask but can't quite help themselves. She smiled at me and said, "If you graduated 8 months ago, did your family come to the ceremony?" The room went completely quiet. I looked at my parents. My father's jaw was set. My mother had stopped touching her necklace. I answered honestly. "They had a venue tour that weekend," I said. The timing didn't work out. Nobody said anything for a moment. They didn't need to. The math was simple enough that 200 people could do it simultaneously. A daughter who graduated early, built a career, became self-sufficient, and did all of it without an audience, while her family attended venue tours and florist appointments and called her attitude a problem when she couldn't clear her schedule to help. I handed the microphone back. I said goodnight to Amber and Connor at the head table, meaning it. Amber looked like she was running several calculations at once. Connor gave me a small nod that I thought was probably genuine. I went back to my seat, stayed for another 20 minutes so it wouldn't look like a dramatic exit, and then I got my jacket and walked out to the parking lot. Outside, the air was cool, and the fountain was still going, and the valets were talking quietly by the entrance. I stood there for a moment and felt something I don't have a perfect word for. Not triumph, because it hadn't felt like a fight. Not relief exactly, because I hadn't been scared. Something quieter than both of those. The feeling of a story finally being told by the right person. In the months that followed, my career kept moving. I took on additional contracts. My savings grew past what I'd projected. I moved into a better apartment and furnished it without asking anyone for anything. My parents called eventually. The tone was different. Not apologetic exactly. My father doesn't really have an apology register. But different. Careful in a way they'd never been with me before. I set some things out clearly in that conversation. What I would and wouldn't be available for. What I expected from interactions going forward. I said it without anger because I'd processed most of the anger somewhere on the drive home from the wedding, with the windows down and the radio up. I didn't do any of this to punish them. I want to be clear about that. I told the truth at that reception because a false version of my life had just been presented to 200 people, and I was holding the microphone and I had the option. That's all it was. What my parents misunderstood for years, maybe forever, is that the tuition money was never the thing that had power over me. The thing that had power over me was the belief that I needed their approval to know my own worth. And somewhere in the middle of 4 years of scholarships and weekend shifts and early mornings and late submissions and a thesis I wrote, between closing down a cafe and opening it the next morning, I stopped believing that. They thought the money was the leash. The leash had been in my own hand the whole time. I just finally let go of it. If you've ever been quietly underestimated by the people who had every opportunity to see you clearly, this is for you. Drop a comment below, tell me your story, and if you stayed here until the very last word, you already know what to do.